Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Well, I thought we would turn from the focus that we've had really in Mississauga and the GTA in the last little while to taking a look at Canada and Western Canada, specifically the oil and gas business. And so, therefore, my guest tonight is Lisa Baiton. She is the CEO of the Canadian Petroleum. What is it? The Canadian Petroleum Institute?
The Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, or
The
CAP.
Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. And you've been going across the country. I've noticed you've been making speeches everywhere.
Just a little bit, yeah, going coast to coast and trying to tell the great story that of our industry is one of the biggest GDP and economic generators for our country, and yeah, it's been having terrific traction.
And you're starting to have some impact. You said that Nick Nanos did a survey and said that people are starting to believe that what you're saying is relevant.
Yeah, just to provide you with that, Nick Nanos came out today with his most recent data and said more Canadians are supporting the oil and gas industry as meat and potato issues such as affordability, jobs, and inflation hit home. And he also noted that almost 3/4 of Canadians consider the oil and gas industry to be very important to the country's economy. So almost 3/4, and that's up 65% from 2020. And his comment was the fact that you have 74% of Canadians agreeing on anything is really quite striking. So it's great that our industry is our voice is being heard, and we're having a more balanced and holistic discussion on the combination of things like economy and affordability and climate and energy security.
So, Lisa, let's take a big step back, if you could.
Sure.
There's a whole bunch of geopolitical events that we're well aware of in regards to, the wars in the Middle East and particularly Eastern Europe that are having an impact on energy and nuclear versus oil and gas versus liquefied natural gas versus coal, et cetera, et cetera. We've got, a whole bunch of regulatory action in Canada, whether it be, positive for oil and gas and buying and opening up pipelines versus climate change. Tell me where you think you are as an industry and how are you sort of managing through, all this regulatory change that's positive and negative, as well as these geopolitical events that are positive and negative.
Well, maybe we can start macro and go micro, and maybe a good place to start would be just kind of taking a global view on where Canada's places in the world these days and some of the challenges facing us, particularly when it comes to attracting investment and the productivity crisis we have here at home, because that not only is an indicator of quality of life, but also Canada's performance in things like innovation and research and development. And Brian, I would say as a Canadian, and not even as with the role I have with that hat on, as a Canadian, I'm really worried about where Canada stands in the world, and I think all Canadians should be really worried. We continue to face significant challenges. You talked about the geopolitical volatility and trade, economics, and energy, but with that, a lot is changing, including Canada's relationships with long-term trading partners and our reputation as a country within the Western Alliance, as a G7 member and a NATO partner, and with that comes a whole host of other consequences, including Canada's competitiveness globally. And people, in Canada, I don't think are really fully understanding that Canada is falling very far behind, most advanced economies on the most meaningful economic indicators.
What things do you look at that say to you that we're falling behind in Canada?
Well, I would say there's a number of key indicators that we could point to, particularly with respect to productivity and investment. But you talked about my speaking tour across the country. One of the things I've been talking a lot about lately is Canada's per capita GDP as a measure of Canada's productivity and quality of life. And if you look back over the past 5 years, Canada's per capita GDP has flatlined. It's flatlined, with less than 1% growth. And by contrast, most of our OECD counterparts over the same period have had 5.6% growth. So we're less than 1%, and our OECD counterparts at 5.6%. And the OECD also has kind of a forecast forward and has Canada listed as the worst performing economy, dead last out of all 38 countries. And they have us pegged there for the next 40 years in terms of achieving the lowest real GDP per capita growth. And so, it's very worrisome that, we're dead last amongst all 38 countries. And you've heard recently the Bank of Canada declare a emergency, a productivity emergency, a break the glass moment, warning that productivity and low business environment is a major problem for our country. And so, that all adds up to stagnant economic growth. It adds up to, an impact on Canadians' living standards, and that's, falling far behind as is their hope for future opportunities.
I was at a conference recently where the economist that was the keynote speaker said that we're actually in a per capita GDP recession. So that GDP growth on a per capita basis was actually negative. And so the only reason why we weren't, he would suggest, in an actual theoretical, recession, was because of population growth that was keeping the GDP positive, but that on a per capita basis, we were negative. Why do you think we've come to this situation where, our productivity, our prosperity has declined so dramatically? I think the numbers that I heard was a 40% decline in prosperity over the course of the last 5 years versus the United States. What's happened? What's gone on?
Well, I represent the Canadian upstream oil and gas sector, so I'm going to try to answer that question through our industry's lens. And I think I've said this to you before in one of our previous podcasts, that one of our Canada's greatest competitive advantages in the global economy is our energy advantage. We are blessed with a world-class resources base. We're the fourth largest oil producer, the fifth largest natural gas producer in the world. We have reserves larger than Russia. But our energy advantage really isn't about just the resource wealth. It's that we produce our product with among the highest human rights and environmental standards in the world. And yet it boggles my mind that instead of wrapping our arms around our own industry as one of the biggest GDP and economic generators in Canada, we have a very complex regulatory and policy environment that seems to want to put it out of business. And from my perspective, if we really had a different vision, we should be aspiring to be the world's most favored trading nation for having the highest human rights and environmental standards in the world, and positioning Canada as a leader in developing innovative technology to lower global emissions, and exporting secure, responsibly produced product to help offset higher emitting sources in other countries like coal in India or in China or in other countries. And we should be loud and proud about the fact that we're a reliable source of energy security, not just for ourselves, but for our allies. We can't have national security or continental security unless you have energy security. And in order to have that, you need to have a very well-functioning producer base in your own economy. And going back to the OECD numbers I chatted with you about, we should just be wrapping our hands around the fact that this industry could be an economic powerhouse, and yet for some reason we just feel the need to. There's a segment in government that really wants to regulate our sector into oblivion.
You talked about the poll, Nick Nanos poll, that suggested that I think you said 75% of Canadians realize how critically important the oil and gas business is to Canada. Are things going to change, do you think? I saw a really interesting story in the Sunday New York Times this past weekend that was looking at Germany and the environmentalists and the Greens in Germany that had a very anti-nuclear stance, a very pro-environmental stance. and that they'd lost power fairly dramatically in the European Parliament elections, and that people's attitudes had changed. Now, it may be because of geopolitical issues, such that they're having to find other sources of electricity after they've lost the access to natural gas from Russia. But it was an attitude that they made a mistake by moving away from nuclear and other energy sources, and that they were going to become more reasonable. Do you think that attitude could happen in Canada, that people could come back from this sort of extreme environmentalist attitude to a more reasoned situation where we understand the importance of the oil and gas business?
Well, a couple things on that point. I think certainly the Russian invasion of Ukraine was certainly a wake-up call for Europe about the fact that you can't be naive about where your energy comes from. And in the case of Russia, you can weaponize energy or access to energy. And so, that brings me back to the comment I made earlier about the importance of, you can't have national security or continental security unless you have absolute energy security as defined as affordable, accessible when you need it. And so I think there's been, in the case of Europe and in the case of Germany, a real wake-up call. You've seen Germany shift its view of, for example, of LNG. A couple of years ago, they would have said liquefied natural gas, or LNG, is a transition fuel, and yet in the last 2 years, as part of their move to ensure that they have their own national security / energy security, they have built three, count them, 1, 2, 3, LNG import facilities in under 2 years. I wish we could get things built like that in Canada. The other thing I'll say is,
I thought our Prime Minister said there wasn't a business case for that.
well, yeah, we like to point that out quite regularly, that the irony of Germany coming to Canada looking for our LNG resources, saying that there's no business case, and then them going away and building 3 LNG import facilities. I would say,
And is it true? I apologize. Let me interrupt. And is it true that we're selling our natural gas to the United States, and the United States is taking their natural gas and liquefying it and selling it to Germany at a far higher substantial
I
profit?
wear a different hat. I spent a third of my career through 3 CEOs and one of the top 10 global funds, Canadian funds. And probably 10 or 12 years ago, we were super excited about Canada seizing the LNG opportunity. And due to the government, Canadian government complexity and policy environment, that capital went elsewhere. Investors need regulatory certainty, and if they don't have it, it'll go elsewhere. And that LNG opportunity should have been Canada's 12 years ago, and much of that has gone to the US. Probably 7 years ago, the US was nowhere on LNG, and now they're the world's largest LNG exporter in the world. So we still have a lot in queue. We have LNG Canada coming online next year, and we have a lot of other LNG projects in the queue. But we should have seized that global opportunity. But just on your other point, I think there's a couple other points on your question in terms of Europe. You're certainly seeing a lot shift in Europe in terms of EU elections, and with that, I think you're seeing a trend towards more pragmatism and the merging of environmental policy with industrial policy, because people are really waking up to the fact that the equally important goals of climate have to be paired with economy and affordability and national and energy security. So you're seeing a lot more pragmatism happen even in Europe on energy policy. And then I would just say, just generally globally, the reality is that the energy transition narrative is increasingly going to be driven by the affordability concerns by the consumers in the global north. So, for example, in Canada. And the reality is demand for oil and gas is, and quite frankly, the demand for all forms of energy continues to grow. And that is also being driven by the new demands from folks in the global south or the emerging middle class.
But you know, Lisa, I keep hearing comments about peak oil and peak oil demand and stuff like that. Let's take a break for some messages and come back and ask you, you know, are we at peak oil demand or is it going to continue increasing? Stay with us, everyone. We're going to be back in 2 minutes with Lisa Baiton, the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. Stay with us. Back in 2. Here we go. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Lisa Baiton. She is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. Lisa, you know, we met when you were working and living in Toronto. What gives? Like, what are you doing in Calgary?
I know. Well, first of all, I was born and raised in Saskatchewan, so I am actually Western Canadian gal, but I did spend 35 years out east and around the globe. But this opportunity came up, and the reason I took it was that it's so important for Canada. Our industry is so important for Canada, and really wanted to make sure that I could do everything within my sphere of influence to ensure that one of the biggest economic generators and job creators and GDP generators is able to continue to be that for Canada and for Canadians going forward.
We had out-migration from the GTA to Alberta, primarily to Calgary, but also to Edmonton. Do you think that that was a smart move for those people moving to Calgary?
I think everybody has to do their own personal math on what's right for them.
Oh, come on. You're going to tell me how cheap the housing is, right?
My real estate dollar goes 3 or 4 times further out in Calgary than it does in Toronto. So, and the traffic is significantly better than in Toronto. But I love Toronto. I lived in Toronto for 26 years, and I'm a big lover of Toronto. So, don't miss it.
Well, we miss you, but we think that you're doing a great job out in Calgary. So we just have to come visit you sometime. So let me tell you, let me ask you about peak demand. Lots of people have talked about peak oil, peak demand. Is oil demand going to continue going up, or do we actually need to develop more oil reserves, or are we at peak demand?
Well, I would say a couple things. I would say the business fundamentals for the Canadian oil and gas industry are very strong because there is a growing global market for Canada's oil and gas resources. All credible forecasts are showing that demand for oil and gas will continue for decades. Currently oil and gas currently makes up over 50% of total energy demand, and that demand continues to grow. And if you look at a recent RBC report, it projected that by 2035, the world will need to add another United States worth of energy just to meet the needs of a growing global population. So I think governments globally are really coming to terms with the hard realities of the energy transition and the need for pragmatism. And they're recognizing that traditional energy sources are going to be required for the decades ahead. And I think the only true debate is around the pace of demand growth.
What does Canada need to do? What are the hurdles that we've got to meet to address this opportunity?
There's quite a few. It's frustrating because, as I said before, we're blessed with this world-class resources base, and we produce our product with among the highest human rights and environmental standards in the world, particularly when you compare us to places like Russia or Venezuela or Iran. But the greatest barrier to Canada, seizing that potential is, as I said earlier, a really uncompetitive and complex regulatory environment. It's an environment that sees us languishing in an ever more competitive global economy. We're seeing that in what the Bank of Canada is saying. We're seeing that in the OECD stats placing us dead last. And it doesn't really acknowledge the critical importance of our sector to domestic energy security and national security or Western alliance security, doesn't recognize us as an economic powerhouse for this country. It doesn't recognize us as a pathway for meaningful Indigenous reconciliation. And it certainly doesn't recognize that we are among the largest spenders in clean technology innovation in the country, that we have a decades-long track record in lowering GHG emissions. Yeah, we have a very punitive approach to regulation. And, especially when you look at the US next door, it's kind of an all-you-can-eat buffet of carrots, driving an investment and creating jobs in our sector.
Lisa, you used the adjective punitive regulation. Punitive regulation. Other people have used the word, glacial, to describe the time it takes to get approvals for environmental approvals for projects. Why do we have this excessive red tape and regulation?
Oh, we don't have enough time to get into that, Brian. But I would agree with the statement that it is both glacial and it is punitive. So on the glacial front, I would say the Canadian regulatory and policy environment really is glacial. It does ignore the time value of money and the need for critical infrastructure. The time to get things built in this country on average is up to 16 years. And then I talked about Germany earlier. They were able to conceive, develop, and build 3 LNG infrastructure import facilities in under 2 years. Why can't we do that? And then in terms of punitive, I think it's very true. Particularly for our sector, we are being singled out, and to the detriment of Canada and our economy, and ultimately to Canadians. My sector employs over 400,000 Canadians from coast to coast, and has some of the highest paying jobs in market. And it's and we're one of the biggest taxpayers in the economy too. So I always just kind of scratch my head and wonder, like, if the goal is to regulate our industry into oblivion, what, pray tell, is going to replace all of those jobs and provide that revenue to fund things like healthcare and
Well, how are we going to power all these electric cars and whatnot that are supposedly the solution, if not natural gas power plants and the like? We've heard a lot about carbon capture and storage investments tax credits. Tell me, is that helpful, or is there clarity there, or what's going on?
Well, those are some examples where, certainly we could do a lot better job in Canada in terms of policy development. So, we right now as Canada are leaders in carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And there's been a lot of talk federally and provincially for over 3 years about an investment tax credit to help get investment clarity around that. And, 3 years, we've been talking for 3 years, and, that's still, there's a lot of talk coming out of various governments about it, but it still isn't locked and loaded. And in the meantime, the U.S. The U.S. IRA, which is a market incentive program, that's been up and running for over 2 years, and they're just attracting capital and investment and building projects, while we're still 3 years talking about those sort of things. In terms of LNG, there is, it's disappointing. Again, we talked about the LNG, the lost. It's not fully lost, but we should have seized the LNG opportunity over a decade ago, and a real lack of vocal support from our political leadership for LNG trading partnership requests, particularly when we have countries like Germany and Poland and Japan and Greece coming to Canada going, we'd love to buy your product, and they're getting turned away is really disappointing. And I would say the biggest thing we're facing right now federally and in British Columbia is a proposed emissions cap framework, which is, not only an unnecessary policy layer, on top of already unwieldy stack of regulations on, again, that singles out our industry. The reality is if those come into place, it's going to cap production, and that is going to have really serious impacts for our sector, for the economy, and for the jobs in our sector.
I thought I heard something about the Supreme Court ruling that the federal government was too involved in areas of provincial jurisdiction in regards to environmental approvals and the like. Has the federal government changed their attitude toward regulation at all, given that finding?
So you're talking about the federal government's Bill C-69, the Impact Assessment Act. And yes, that is a very problematic piece of legislation. The government of Alberta did take the federal government to the Supreme Court over that. My organization did a formal intervention in that Supreme Court deliberation, and the Supreme Court did come out with a decision that said that there was overreach. The federal government is currently putting forward some amendments, but from what I've seen, it doesn't do anything to really shorten the time it takes to get things built in this country. And you'd have to go talk to the government of Alberta, but I don't think it necessarily satisfies them in terms of encroachment, in terms of areas of provincial constitutional authority.
So you say these emission caps are going to cap production. What's your organization's stance on these emission caps?
Well, again, we going back to the OECD in terms of, and then the Bank of Canada, we're in a productivity and an attracting investment crisis. And I would say this type of policy is really an example of what's driving investment away from Canada. We just released a report completed by S&P Global Commodity Insights that examined the opportunity of my sector, which includes everything from oil and natural gas and the oil sands, and what would happen if a cap was actually implemented on the industry. And it shows that a stringent emissions cap of 40% applied to the conventional side of would lead to a 1 million barrel of oil equivalent per day reduction by 2030. And it just sorry. Can we press pause and pick it up? I'm dealing with the cold. Are we?
Sorry, Lisa, what did the study show?
The S&P Global Insights study showed that a stringent 40% emissions cap applied to our industry could lead to a 1 million barrel of oil equivalent per day reduction by 2030. And I would just say, the assessment.
Put that in perspective, because what is that 1 million barrel a day reduction? Is that a large number or a small number in percentage terms?
Well, I don't have the exact percentage terms, but it's effectively in some cases a production shut-in. So, but the assessment isn't all bad news. The other thing that that study looked at was the opportunity, what the industry could do under the current policy environment without an emissions cap, and it shows that the industry could contribute over $1 trillion. $1 trillion. I feel like Austin Powers, $1 trillion in cumulative GDP, and sort of support up to 383,000 jobs annually out to 2035. So, proponents of the cap will argue that it's necessary to accelerate emissions reductions in the oil and gas sector, citing climate change and international commitments. But from our perspective, we're already among the most highly regulated in the world. It's unnecessary. It's counterproductive. And furthermore, I would say, if you curtail Canadian production, which again is produced with among the highest human rights and environmental standards in the world, is going to do absolutely nothing to lower global demand growth for oil and gas, or it will do nothing to lower GHG global emissions, because that demand will be there, and they'll just go to places like Russia or Iran or Venezuela for their energy.
Well, worse, it's not only going to demand for oil and gas from those countries, but understand that people are building new coal plants, and so we're using worse forms of hydrocarbons to produce energy today, are we not?
For sure. If I look at in just one example of countries who are moving to coal, let me give you the example of India. Coal is the mainstay of their power generation and the backbone of India's economy. And they recently communicated their very unabashed intention to double coal production for their electricity generation to 1.5 billion tons by 2030. And that is really going to have an outsized impact on the global environmental balance sheet. If you look at an analysis from the National Bank of Canada, it found that exporting Canadian liquefied natural gas, or LNG, to offset India's expected growth in coal consumption could make a bigger impact on lowering global emissions than shutting down the Canadian economy in its entirety. So yeah, there's a lot of proof points that even if you shut in the Canadian oil and gas industry, all it will do is destroy the Canadian economy, destroy jobs,
And not help the environment, because the people will be doing the same, if not far worse, with coal in other countries.
exactly.
Doesn't make a lot of sense. I think one of the other things you talk about, though, is investment. And there's been a lot of articles in the press lately about how pension funds, and even, Canadian pension funds owned by the federal government haven't been investing, what people deem to be the appropriate amount in Canada. And if we're not giving them those opportunities and they're going to invest elsewhere, that's damaging not only to our oil and gas business, but to our basic economy. We're not, investing in Canada, and the lack of business investment in Canada is one of the biggest negatives to our productivity and our prosperity. So maybe we'll take a break and come back and talk to you a little bit about how do we improve um, the investment business in oil and gas in Canada. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes with Lisa Baiton.
Do you want me
Welcome
to
back,
start?
everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Sagan and 60. We're I think really focusing in on the future of the Canadian economy, particularly oil and gas, but really, productivity, prosperity writ large, with Lisa Baiton, who is the president and CEO of an organization that focuses on the oil and gas business. It is the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, CAPP. Lisa's got a long history in public affairs. She previously was the vice president of practice lead government relations at Environics Research, and she was the managing director, head of global public affairs and global leadership team at the Canadian Pension Plan. And she's been involved in lots of different public affairs. She's got an MBA from both the Schulich School of Business as well as the Kellogg School of Management, Northwestern University in Chicago. So you've got smart academic background, smart experience, politically involved. You've got it all.
You're making me blush, Brian.
And now you're living in Calgary, and you've got the cowboy boots and the cowboy hat.
I have the
Um,
cowboy boots. I do have the cowboy hat. Yes, I do.
so let's talk about investment. Why are these pension funds, Canadian pension funds, not investing in the Canadian oil and gas business, and why aren't we attracting, international pension funds and other people to come invest in the Canadian oil and gas business?
Well, I think we're starting to see some of that investment capital come back. I recently met with a roadshow of about 16 institutional investors. So I think that the interest is definitely coming back. But to your bigger question about, how come Canada's not attracting the level of investment that we should be, really it comes down to the fact that, if we want to develop new technologies, if we want to build projects, if we want to export goods, if we want to create jobs and opportunities for a growing population, we need really successful and growing businesses, and productivity and innovation go hand in hand, and one follows the other in a cycle. But importantly, and my critical point here is that the cycle begins with successful and growing businesses, and you have to satisfy that condition first. And to do that, Canada really has to be competitive for investment capital, and we haven't been. And that's because to be competitive for investment capital, as we've been talking about, investors need regulatory and policy certainty, and we don't offer that here in Canada. And I think what people don't realize is that competition for capital is global. And I also point out for folks that it's not just infrastructure projects or capital for companies that's competitive. Competing for investment in decarbonization projects is also competitive, because when investors consider where to place their dollars, particularly when those projects are really large scale, they're over decades, where the outcomes can be binary. Investors are really looking at which country has the most predictable regulatory and policy framework, which has the most incentives, because those payback periods are very long, and sometimes there's a lot of investment risk associated with that. And so, here in Canada, we have a policy environment that provides uncertainty and risk, and that's impeding the cost of capital, and in turn, that's making that cost of capital become prohibitive. And the cumulative result is that Canada really is failing to attract that very large scale, long-term capital investment that we need to push forward to a lower emission, sustainable and prosperous economy.
Lisa, I bought a facility in Fort McMurray, and I got to go up there and do due diligence and tour around. Number one, I was amazed at the size of the plants, the trucks, the housing. Like it was really quite impressive. I think that one of the things that maybe I think I'm reasonably enough of a news junkie that I would have known and appreciated the immense investment in Fort McMurray and obviously other places, but I didn't. And so seeing it firsthand really was quite impactful on me. And then the second thing is, as I sat down and talked to numerous different people in the oil and gas business, the politicians, the economic development people, and just frankly the Uber drivers and taxi drivers, I was expecting people were going to be climate change deniers, but they weren't. They were very supportive of efforts to reduce GHG. They were, believing and talking about investments in carbon capture. They were very interested in improving the emissions, and proud of the different companies' investment in that regard. We're spending billions of dollars incentivizing electric battery companies to come to Ontario, and car companies to come to Ontario. Are we doing the right things to help your industry, particularly as it relates to some of these positive environmental actions like carbon capture, et cetera? When I say our, I'm meaning our federal government.
I think that we're not doing enough. But I'm glad you had that perception, and I wish more people would have the opportunity to go to the communities that are supported by the oil and gas industry, and see how many jobs are being created by that, and the tax revenue that's supporting communities and healthcare and social programs. And our wages are higher than most wages in other sectors, and we're one of the biggest employers of Indigenous peoples in Canada, and we're moving to an even greater equity ownership by Indigenous people in projects. And so, to your point, what people don't always understand is we're a critical piece of the energy transition. Some of the most interesting things that are happening on the energy transition is the investment that our industry is making in the technology and in clean technology innovation, and our industry has over a decades long track record of meaningfully reducing GHG emissions while increasing production. So I'm not surprised by your story that by going to Fort Mac, our industry are not climate deniers. We are very loud and proud of the fact that we are among the nation's largest investors in clean technology and innovation, and we're one of the, you won't get to net zero without our industry. And I'm not surprised by the sentiments you got on Main Street, and that people are very proud to have our industry because we're big job creators and we're big community contributors.
So Lisa, what do we got to do? What do we got to do to revive our investment, our prosperity, revive Canada?
Well, I would just say we need to start playing to our strengths. First, I'm a common sense kind of a gal. We need to take a pragmatic approach to the energy transition that's underway to meet the targets set by the federal government. We need more. We need to attract more capital. We need to do more investment in technology facilities. We need to be able to build major infrastructure at a scale never seen before in Canadian history, and we have to do it a lot faster. If you look at the federal government's own estimates, they suggest that Canada is going to have to invest between 125 and 140 billion dollars every year between now and 2050. And right now, we're attracting less than 1/5 of that investment amount. So,
sorry, hold it. That 120, that 125 to 140, is that in the oil and gas business or in business generally?
Just generally.
And we're only attracting 20% of what we need?
Yeah. So we really need a plan with pragmatic timelines that considers what actually can be achieved, and just, demanding more urgency or layering more policy on and constraining, the growth generators in our country without creating an environment for success is only going to create disorder and failure and keep us dead last in among advanced economies. I would say, secondly, Brian, we really need to fix our approach to major projects and ensure that we can get approvals and permitting, and we can actually build things in a reasonable time frame. And we talked about this earlier, but Canada's timelines for getting things built trails our peers like Germany, like Australia, like the United States, like the UK, like Sweden. And then there's no reason we should take 9 to 16 years to get major projects built when other countries are being able to do it in a fraction of that time. And I would say thirdly, and if you don't have investor certainty, that's not going to happen, and you can't have investor certainty unless we provide them with regulatory certainty. So we really need Canadian governments, federally, provincially, municipally, to really champion major investment opportunities like that's happening in every other country in the world. And to do that, we really need governments to remove some of the regulatory layers and policy complexity. We need a cohesive national vision that enhances the well-being of all Canadians. And we can equally balance the equally important objectives of environmental protection, as well as energy security and national security, as well as economy and affordability. It can be done holistically, and we're seeing that shift happen all around the globe, and Canada just needs to catch up.
This is amazing, Lisa. I've been very involved in housing inaffordability issues in the Greater Toronto Area of late. And the issue is, number one, that we're building 20% of what we need. So, supply is not close to meeting demand. Number two, that approval time frames are, 3 or 4 times longer to get the approval than it is to actually build a home. And number three, the risk that, everyone's saying you can't get approved. You got to go to the Ontario Land Tribunal before you'll actually get built what you want. The risk and uncertainty is huge. It's the same 3 things in the housing and affordability, sector and issue as it is that you're talking about. It's we're not building or investing nearly enough. The time, because of red tape and regulation, that it takes to get approval is way too long and longer than any of our peers internationally. And 3, there's risk all the way along, such that your cost of capital is higher, the chance of failure is greater, the political influence inappropriate at times is greater. It's red tape and regulations. Why can't we get our act together?
Well, I think there's tangible proof points around the globe that it is possible. And at the end of the day, although I started the conversation with the fact that I'm very worried for my country, and I agree, I stand behind that statement. I'm an optimist, and I'm hoping that Canadians, and in particular, the governments who represent Canadians, really see where we are in the world, and I don't know about you, but I don't think Canadians like losing, and I don't think Canadians, if they were to know that we were dead last among all 38 OECD advanced countries, would much like that. So, I think that if we can have conversations and raise awareness about that, I think there's some optimism that maybe some of that can change.
I don't know why we like losing so much. It's really a question. We're going to take a break and come back with some concluding comments. I'm going to ask Lisa about LNG really quickly, and then we're going to wrap everything up. Back in 2 minutes with Lisa Baiton, the CEO of the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. Back in two. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour in Saga 960. A real pleasure to be chatting again with Lisa Baiton, the CEO, President and CEO of the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, coming in tonight to us from downtown Calgary, Alberta. Even though she's a long-term Toronto gal, she's now ensconced back in Western Canada, where she comes from, and she's supporting the oil and gas industry. I got to tell you, we've talked about LNG tonight. Last time we chatted, we talked about it. Your comment about Germany building 3 LNG plants, and Canada couldn't even have a business case that would justify building a pipeline and a plant to ship it out in Atlantic Canada, is astounding to me. Are you excited, or are you depressed by LNG right now?
I would say a little of both. But I would say one of the most exciting opportunities for growth for the whole of the Canadian economy is the emerging liquefied natural gas export industry. There is a long-term market for it. And exporting LNG, Canadian LNG, is one of the biggest things we can do to lower global emissions. But the opportunity is here and now. We've lost a lot of time and market share to countries like the US, but there is optimism there. LNG Canada, which represents the largest private investment ever made in this country, is set to start operations next year. And we also have 3 other LNG export facilities that are hopefully going to get final investment decision. And we're also hoping that LNG Canada will have a phase 2. So, but it goes back to what we talked about, Brian. If we really want that to happen, we need to address the policy environment here, and we have a choice. We can build an entirely new export industry for liquefied natural gas, and with that, bring those high-value, high-paying jobs and billions of dollars investments to Canada while lowering global emissions. But if we don't do it, other countries will, like the US, are happy to take that market share for us. So we don't have a lot of time. We just need to get down to it and address things and turn the tide and start attracting investment.
So, Lisa, we've talked about how real median incomes haven't grown, how we might be in a per capita recession today, how Canadian productivity used to be equal to the United States, is now 40% below. Prosperity is being challenged. You mentioned that we're dead last in the OECD and projections for economic growth in the future. It's a pretty dismal report card that we've got. Are you sanguine? Are you depressed? Or do you see some glimmer of hope for Canada? What's your sense?
Well, maybe let me conclude with where I started. And I would say there is a vision for Canada, and it's the one that the OECD is predicting, that Canada is going to be the worst performing economy, dead last out of all 38 advanced countries for the next 40 years. And with that is going to come a whole host of devastating consequences for for Canada and our economy. And I don't know about you, Brian, but I really don't like that vision very much, and I want to do
I
everything
sure don't. It's not very good.
part of my role at CAP to do within my sphere of influence to change that. I would say though, there is an alternative, an alternative vision, and it's one that's very much within our reach, in which after 2050, Canada has the lowest emitting oil and natural gas products for as long as there is demand for them. A world where Canada is positioned competitively as the most favored producing nation, because we do produce our product with the highest human rights and environmental standards, among the highest in the world. And I would love to have a vision where we as a nation have a credible track record of building not just one or two projects, but multiple nation building projects that are going to ensure that Canadians receive full value for our natural resources, and enable us to grow and export our supply of that responsibly produced product. But in doing that, we really have to tackle the investment and productivity challenge, and to do that, we need to address the policy environment. And if we can get that right, we can ensure that billions of dollars in investment come to Canada. We can take our place as a leader in providing secure, responsibly produced product to lower emissions. We'll enhance our geopolitical influence and our reputation as a G7 member and NATO partner, and hopefully we can recapture Canada's position of economic strength.
You know, it's interesting that the United States, with some of the Bidenomics that have maybe not captured people's imagination, and people may not feel that they're working, but appear to be really working in the United States. And the CHIP Act and the infrastructure investments and the Inflation Reduction Act and some of the investments there really seem to have spurred economic growth, such that the United States is now one of the top performing countries in the world, which is a big challenge for us when we think about an independent monetary policy and the exchange rate and inflation rates, and how we compare our housing prices, our investment statistics, our salaries, the opportunities for us and for our kids. I think we've got an example south of the border of a country that got its act together and really is doing the right things from an investment standpoint. And we've languished, and I think it's a real problem. I really thank you for coming on and talking about your sector, but also, challenging us to think about the balance, because I think a lot of the things that you've addressed, you could apply to uranium, you could apply to housing, you could apply to a lot of other sectors of our society where we've got too much red tape, too much regulation, time for approval is too slow, risk is great, so the cost of capital is higher. And so therefore, investors are just saying, why should I invest here? Even in the shopping center business, I got to tell you, people are looking to move their capital elsewhere out of Canada, and really questioning whether they can make good money in real estate in something that is as basic as shopping centers. So, Lisa, thank you for raising the issues, and thank you for traveling across Canada, and thank you for, even though you've got all these challenges that you've identified, still being optimistic about where the future of Canada can go. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me, Brian. I really appreciate you.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to Lisa Baiton from the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers for joining us. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online, even from Calgary, at www.saga960am.ca. All my podcasts and videos are put up on my website, briancrombie.com, as soon as the show goes to air. Thanks, Lisa. Good night, everybody.